No injury in sports is more devastating to hear than the Achilles tear. Achilles tears tend to be worse as they usually happen later in a player's career and are often impossible to fully recover from. Due to the nature of the Achilles tendon, many athletes lose the explosiveness, speed, and agility before an injury. Let's look at some recent occurrences of the most devastating injury in sports. These are 10 NBA players who tore their Achilles tendon. The most notorious Achilles tear in recent history is Kobe Bryant's. At 34 years old, he was willing a failed super team Los Angeles Lakers into the playoffs. Amidst a season that saw inconsistent playing time from Steve Nash and Pau Gasol, the Lakers had relied on Bryant, and he would play in 78 of 80 games, averaging 39 minutes per game, a grave toll on a 17-year veteran. In the 80th game of the season, the Lakers were fighting with the Golden State Warriors for one of the last playoff spots. This crucial matchup would see Kobe Bryant going up against a young and up-and-coming Steph Curry. Early into this game, Kobe had already had an injury scare. Just over a minute into the third quarter, Bryant would spin into a layup and collide midair with a Festus Ezeli. Kobe would then be seen clutching his left knee on the ground, but he would remain in the game, only to be seen limping again just 3 minutes later. By this point, the Lakers should have just benched Bryant, but an exploding Steph Curry on the other end and the resistance of the Black Mamba begged to differ. In a 2-point game with just 3 minutes left in the fourth, Bryant would spin to the right, pushing off of his left leg. Immediately, he would fall to the ground, and this would end Bryant's career as we know it. Famously, he would hobble to the free throw line, sink 2 shots before leaving the game. Kobe's extraordinary efforts won the Lakers the game and let them make the playoffs, but it was at the cost of his entire career. Bryant would return to basketball in December the following season, which is actually a remarkable return for an Achilles tear, only missing 240 days. But in his return against the Toronto Raptors, he would be inefficient, putting up 9 points, 8 rebounds, 4 assists, and 8 turnovers. He would play just 6 games this season, and for all 6 of those games, he was off, clearly not have fully recovered from his devastating injury. Shortly after returning, he would suffer a fracture in his knee that would rule him out for 6 weeks, and with the Lakers' miserable record, he would eventually be ruled out for the entire season. In 2015, Kobe came back slightly better looking, but older from when we saw him last at his peak. Constant soreness all over his body led to higher load management. Bryant was unable to just will himself to success like we saw in previous seasons. In 35 games, he would shoot just 37% from the field. In a game against the New Orleans Pelicans, Bryant would drive to the baseline and finish with a 2-handed dunk. He would then be removed from the game and would be seen wearing an ice pack on his right shoulder. But despite the injury, the right-handed Kobe would come back into the game, playing exclusively from his left hand. But the torn rotator cuff would take him out for the rest of the season, and shortly into the 2016 season, Kobe would announce that this would be his final year of basketball. While he remained relatively healthy, playing in 66 games, his averages and efficiency fell across the board. Bryant was unable to attack the paint and relied on deep mid-range shots and three-pointers. His last season saw him shooting a career-high 7 threes per game at a disgusting rate of 38%. Thankfully, the Black Mamba would put up one more legendary performance for all of us to remember him by, but without a doubt, the Achilles tear assassinated Kobe. Bryant would never again be in MVP or All-NBA conversations. While the Achilles injury may not have led to a rotator cuff tear, it is the primary reason why Bryant looked like a remarkable different player in just 2 seasons. And Kobe wasn't the only 2000 star to suffer to the same fate. Someone who had dealt with this issue just a few years earlier was Chauncey Billups. In 2009, Billups had made his 7th straight conference finals appearance with the Denver Nuggets, a feat only accomplished by players of the Showtime Lakers and 60 Celtics. He earned his last All-Star appearance and was 6th in MVP voting, but just 2 years later, he would find himself moved down to the shooting guard position in a backcourt with Chris Paul on the Los Angeles Clippers. To start off the year, he was putting up relatively similar stats for at least the first 20 games. In the third quarter in a game against the Orlando Magic, Billups would awkwardly fall while reaching for a loose ball. He would be walked off the court before it was revealed that he had torn his Achilles tendon. Despite the devastating news, Billups wasn't ready to call it quits, citing how he had fought his entire career to be where he was right now. It would be nearly 300 days before Chauncey returned to the court, but he would only play 22 games since returning due to health concerns. Billups would come back one more time, this time re-signing with his Detroit Pistons, but a knee problem would allow him to play in less than just 20 games. Chauncey announced his retirement in the following offseason, with his health being the main reason he could no longer play. Despite Billups being one of the healthier and more consistent players of the 2000s, he would play just 41 games after tearing his Achilles tendon. For Chauncey Billups and Kobe Bryant, the Achilles tear marked the end of their prime, forcing the two into injury-plagued years and retirement. For Elton Brand, he got a different side of the coin. Brand was one of the rising stars of the early 2000s. He was one of the few bright spots on a dreadful Los Angeles Clippers team. In training camp prior to the 2007 to 2008 season, Brand would tear his Achilles tendon during drills. He would play just the last few games of the season before opting out of his contract and signing with the Philadelphia 76ers. Brand, who had only missed 4 games in the 3 years before his Achilles tear, would miss most of the 2009 season due to a shoulder injury. Once he was healthy as a 76er, his minutes and numbers would fall across the board. Elton would never average again what he did in Los Angeles and was waived under the amnesty clause. Brand would bounce between the Dallas Mavericks and Atlanta Hawks before retiring as a 76er. The Achilles tear robbed Brand of his emerging star career. In his own words, he never had the same play and explosiveness after the injury. But Brand changed the way he dunked. He used 2 legs instead of raising off of 1. He added in a mid-range game, but he became known as one of the best locker room guys and one of the best veterans in the league. Despite getting a devastating injury at a young age, he managed to form a 17-year-long NBA career. Jonas Jerebko and Christian Laettner were 2 players in similar positions to Elton Brand. As we know, Achilles tears often permanently affect an athlete's agility, explosiveness, and leaping. Most often, Achilles tears occur in older athletes, guys who weren't as healthy, guys who had more mileage on their bodies, in cases like Kobe Bryant, Chauncey Billups, or even a guy like Aaron Rodgers. For Laettner, Jerebko, and Elton Brand, the injury occurred right before or during their prime. First, let's talk about Jerebko. Jonas was a second-round draft pick for the Detroit Pistons, and while he would go on to be a role player for his 9-year career, it wasn't supposed to be like this. He had averaged 9 and 6 and showed promise on the defensive end. He played in 80 games, starting in 73 for his rookie year. Nobody was saying that Jerebko was going to be a future star or anything like that, but in a league where second-round players rarely form year-long careers, Jerebko was looking to be a promising young player. But an Achilles tear in the 2010 preseason would eliminate him for the season and flush his promising start down the drain. Jonas started 73 games in his rookie season. He would only start 46 for the rest of his career. Jerebko would never become the player it seemed that he could be, and while it's impossible to know what his NBA potential was, I'm comfortable saying that he would have been a much better player without this injury. Jerebko fans were surprised on his play starting in the NBA, but for Christian Laettner, he just disappointed. As the 3rd overall pick in the 1992 draft, the back-to-back NCAA champion was expecting to be the centerpiece for the Minnesota Timberwolves. He would average 17, 8, and 3 for his career in Minnesota, but he never became the superstar that was expected out of one of the best college players of all time. He was traded to the Atlanta Hawks, and his first full season at Atlanta, he made his one and only All-Star appearance. 2 years later, it was reported that Laettner, a free agent during the NBA lockout, was injured. The news was devastating. In a pickup game at his alma mater, Duke University, Laettner had torn his Achilles in what was described as a freak accident. He had also just turned down a 7-year contract extension from the Hawks. He was without a team, with his value just being sliced in half. Eventually, the Detroit Pistons would sign him, and it was just 188 days before Laettner returned to the court, but no surprise, he wasn't the player that we knew him as. While he never lived up to the lofty expectations before his injury, he was still a good starting caliber NBA player. But the Achilles rupture would see a drastic decrease in his play and minutes, seeing Laettner bounce around teams until retiring in 2005. Like Laettner, Rudy Gay would start off his career incredibly consistent. Up until tearing his Achilles, Rudy Gay would average at least 19 points per game for almost an entire decade. But in his last game as a Sacramento King, Rudy Gay would turn towards the baseline and fall awkwardly. He would tear his Achilles and eventually go on to sign with the San Antonio Spurs. In every following season, Rudy Gay would not average more than 14 points per game, something he hadn't failed to do beyond his rookie year. He was a decent player in San Antonio. In the Spurs offense, he'd find himself playing in less minutes but still being a relatively efficient player. After San Antonio, he would have a 2-year stint in Utah where age caught up to him. At 37 years old, Rudy Gay has yet to announce his retirement, but I don't think we're going to be seeing him on an NBA team again. Wesley Matthews would also have an incredibly similar starting story to Rudy Gay. He came onto the scene in Portland after replacing Brandon Roy. He was a solid 2-guard for the Blazers, at one point playing over 250 straight games, being nicknamed Iron Man. Matthews, like many other players on this list, went down to a non-contact injury while dribbling, rupturing his Achilles. He would never play in Portland again. 230 days later, Matthews would come back, now a member of the Dallas Mavericks. In Dallas, Matthews remained pretty healthy, playing 78 games in his first game back and over 60 games in the next 2 seasons. Despite his minutes being similar, his numbers were smaller across the board. After being traded from Dallas, Matthews would only average double-digit scoring per game for one more time in his entire career. He also would not stay on a team for more than 1 season, having stints in New York, Indianapolis, Milwaukee, LA, and Atlanta, where he is currently playing right now. While an Achilles tear took away the prime of Matthews' career, like Gay and Laettner, he had managed to adapt himself and remain in the NBA for a long time despite this injury. Demarcus Cousins may be the exact opposite of Wesley Matthews. While Matthews was undrafted, Boogie was selected with the number 5 overall pick. Cousins saw the star career that Matthews never had. He amassed 4 All-Star appearances and 2 All-NBA appearances. In 2017, DeMarcus was traded to the New Orleans Pelicans and joined along Anthony Davis, forming one of the last big men pairings we've seen in the NBA. Over halfway into the 2018 season, Cousins would rupture his Achilles after going after a rebound from his own missed free throw. With a 4-point lead and just 13 seconds left, you could argue that Cousins never needed to do this. He would cut awkwardly and go down grabbing his heel. Unlike everybody mentioned so far, Cousins was in the middle of the prime of his career, and despite playing only 65 games for the Pelicans, he formed a memorable duo with Anthony Davis. Following his injury, DeMarcus Cousins would not receive any contract offers and would be forced to sign a mid-level exception after he had reached out to the Golden State Warriors. Cousins would make his debut in Golden State almost a full year after the injury took place. He played 30 games, averaging 16 points per game in just 26 minutes. While that was still a drop from what he did prior, and he was an even worse defender, he had proved himself to have a role in the league. But if an Achilles tear took away Cousins' prime, an ACL tear would take away his career as we know it. Following the finals loss, Cousins would sign a contract with the LA Lakers, but Boogie would never step onto the court for LA, as he would tear his ACL before the season started. DeMarcus would then go on to have brief stints for the Rockets, Clippers, Bucks, and Nuggets. During all of these times, he would play decently well, at least according to his per 36 or per 100 possession stats. But personality issues, both on and off the court, are one of the primary reasons Boogie Cousins could never stay in the league for too long. At 33 years old, a return is not impossible. He might still just be a starting caliber center. Maybe DeMarcus Cousins will have just one more shot in the league. Now, Cousins is an outlier on this list, as it wasn't exactly his age or even his ability that prevented him from being in the league. As efficient as he was in sparse minutes, I'm not ready to say that he truly recovered from an Achilles tear. But these last 2 players are guys who managed to return to a relatively normal and efficient spot following the injury. The most prolific case of a player recovering from an Achilles tear is Dominique Wilkins. Wilkins, aka the human highlight reel, ruptured his Achilles in a game against the Magic in the 1992 season. For a player built on athleticism and explosiveness, this seemed to be a death sentence for his career, but that could not be further from the truth. Wilkins came back 10 months later and had his best season in years, averaging 30 points per game. He did change up his play style. Like what we saw Elton Brand do, he would jump off of 2 feet instead of jumping off of 1. He added a 3-point shot, something he never had in his game. That year, he would shoot 38% from 3 on 2 makes per game. After his Achilles tear, Dominique Wilkins would make 2 more All-Star appearances and even 2 All-NBA teams. He would bounce around between Boston, San Antonio, and Los Angeles after his time as an Atlanta Hawk, but even in those years after his prime, he was an effective starter and 6th man up until he was 37 years old. And the last and possibly the biggest return from an Achilles rupture is Kevin Durant. Between his play in Brooklyn and Phoenix, it is easy to forget that he has overcome this injury. Unlike some other players, Durant did have the longest recovery time. He would not play for 552 days. Over a year and a half between Game 6 of the finals and his Brooklyn debut. This long resting time must be playing a big factor into why Durant came back so well. While his play and box score has both been wildly successful, good enough for me to say that he has recovered, like everyone else, he has still been different. Over the last few years, Durant has missed more time than usual, but this is something relatively common for his age. But he has also been shooting from outside the basket way more, relying on jumpers and difficult shots over attacking the hoop. Because it's Kevin Durant, he's still doing alright. Not to mention, since 2022, he's doing this on 37 minutes per game, which at 35 years old is absurd regardless of any injury. Now, there are still other players whose careers I didn't mention who suffered this injury. John Wall played after rupturing his Achilles, but his story requires its own video. Elgin Baylor battled with knee injuries for the latter half of his career, but it was a ruptured Achilles tendon at 36 years old that instantly ended his play. Same could be said for Pistons legend Isaiah Thomas, who announced 1994 to be his final season. He ruptured his Achilles against the Magic, forcing his retirement tour to end early. Every single Achilles injury is devastating. It is nearly career-ending. Despite those who have recovered or would go on to form long NBA careers, there is no player in basketball history who came back the exact same. While it's just anecdotal evidence, recovery time may have a connection with how well a player returns. Wilkins, Durant, and Cousins all were on the relatively longer end of recovery times and came back more effective players. Meanwhile, guys like Kobe, who came back quickly, were just not themselves. But this could also just be causation without correlation, as every injury and set of circumstances is different. If you guys do want to see a bit more of a statistical analysis of recovering from an Achilles tear, let me know down below, and it's definitely something that I can take a look at. But these are just some of the stories of the Achilles tear, the most devastating injury in sports. If you guys liked the video, you know what to do, but that is it for this one, and I will catch you guys later.